Today, per subscriber request, we will be talking about Big Ten sleepers, teams who aren't presumed favorites to win the Big Ten or at least win their division, like Iowa and Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio State. Those teams, we will not be discussing them today. We are going to be discussing some under-the-radar teams, teams who are waiting in the forest to ambush the world and shock the world. We're not going to be talking about teams who have, in my opinion at least, no business contending, whether it's a severe deficit in talent, just a long rebuild process they have to go through, etc. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, are Big Ten sleepers. I think, 5 or 6 teams that I'm going to be talking about around there. I'm thinking 5, but without further ado, let's get right into it. And first and foremost, talk about the first Big Ten sleeper, and that is the Michigan State Spartans. Michigan State returns a good quarterback in Peyton Thorne, good wide receivers in Jaden Reed and Jalen Naylor. Michigan State also is very strong at the linebacker position and at the defensive tackle position, Jacob Slade being probably their best defensive tackle, and they bring in nice transfer portal additions. However, their weaknesses at the secondary and the offensive line and their overall lack of talent compared to other schools in their own division cannot be ignored. Michigan State is the perfect example of a sleeper. We saw this last year where everyone expected them to finish last in the Big Ten, East at least, and probably, to be honest with you, one of the worst, if not the worst team in the Big Ten. They finished easily third best by final record, which was 11-2, and by their final poll finish, which was in the top 10. I think Michigan State will go 4th in the Big Ten East because they will lose to Minnesota, Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State. And this is just out of the fact that, their offense will help them beat a lot of teams on their schedule. They'll be explosive. They'll, at some point in every game, be competitive. And outside of the Ohio State game, they'll probably be competitive for 4 quarters in every game. But their secondary issues, their offensive line issues, and really just the fact that Kenneth Walker is irreplaceable, along with some other losses on the offensive side of the ball, I think will hold them back for this year. But if Michigan State decides to mess around and go 11-1, it would not shock me. They're a very volatile team. There are a lot of teams on Michigan State's schedule that they could totally lose to, that they could totally beat, crush. Not just beat, but crush. Maryland is a prime example. Michigan is an example of a team that Michigan State could win or lose to. Really, anyone on their schedule but Ohio State, Michigan State could totally beat, but outside of smaller schools, they could also totally lose to them because of some of their weaknesses. Again, a very volatile team. I'm overall impressed with Mel Tucker and the direction that this program is heading. I think they will be better in future years than they will be this year. I think they'll be around a top 25 team, certainly a contender. Next up, we have Minnesota. Minnesota is a team that has a lot of strengths to it. They have good running back depth. They have Muhammad Ibrahim and Trey Potts returning. They even had some walk-ons who looked really good last year. They lose a lot of their offensive line, but they return their center. They got a transfer portal addition from Michigan and Chuck Filiega. So I think they're set on the offensive line, and they have a really good O-line coach. They also return basically most of their linebacker core, all of their safeties, and they have that row the boat mentality. P.J. Fleck has built an impressive culture there at Minnesota. There is no doubt about that, and that really helps his team push their limits. Joe Rossi is also an amazing defensive coordinator, and Kirk Shiroka is also returning to be their OC. So Minnesota, I think, is just going to be better than they were last year. They do lose a lot on the defensive line and at cornerback as well, and once again, they don't have the same depth as teams in their division, like Wisconsin is a big glaring example, and even Nebraska, but Minnesota they develop very well for what they bring in, and even PJ Fleck's current recruiting classes are much better than Minnesota is accustomed to. I think they'll go 10-2. They'll finish second in the Big Ten West. I think they will lose to Nebraska and also lose, oh my gosh, I think to Wisconsin is who I have their two losses being to. If you want to get more on just my exact schedule opinions and predictions on the teams that I'm talking about, check out my Big Ten way too early Big Ten predictions video that I have linked down below. I'm going to be making one after the spring games as well to update my predictions. But anyway, back to Minnesota. Minnesota is just an all-around impressive team. I think that they could very well win the West for the first time ever since the creation of divisions, and for the first time in a while contend to win for the Big Ten. Honestly, they're a really good team. They're not as volatile as, say, Michigan State. I think they're going to be solidly around the 8, 9, 10 win mark. They're going to be more solid. They're not going to be as good on offense, but they're always a solid defensive team. Quarterback is also a question mark with Minnesota. It will be interesting to see how Tanner Morgan does with Kirk Shiroka back as OC and QB coach. So that is Minnesota, and now on to Nebraska. Now, Nebraska, and if you are a subscriber here for a while, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I think Nebraska is a sleeper who will end up winning their own division. I have them going 10-2, losing to Iowa and Michigan, but beating Minnesota for the tiebreaker. Both would technically be tied first, but due to the tiebreaker, Nebraska would be first, Minnesota would be second. They have a strong quarterback room. It's one of the strongest in the Big Ten. Logan Smothers showed his athleticism. Casey Thompson has shown his throwing ability. He threw amazingly for over 25 touchdowns, several thousand yards, with a broken Texas defense and with a broken thumb that affected him. They also have Chubba Purdy in there as well. At linebacker, they return guys like Nick Henrich. They do lose Phildarius Payne and other pass rushers, and their O-line hasn't been strong, which is why I have trench warfare, which is basically the offensive and defensive lines. I think could be a weakness of this team. Very strong linebacker group. Their secondary has always been strong, and they do, in my opinion, have shock value on their side. Nebraska does. They could come out of nowhere, and because they've had 4 losing seasons in a row, teams might not take them as seriously. They might not be prepping as hard for Nebraska, and Nebraska might also have some momentum and vengeance on their side as well, wanting to finally do something under Scott Frost. Scott Frost will be in his 5th year, and this year I think he needs to win big or he'll get fired. By big, I mean 8, 9, 10 wins is what he needs to keep his job. 6-6 and even 7-5 will not cut it. Team culture is a question mark that I have. It's not a guaranteed weakness, like I think the defensive line and offensive lines will be, though I think the offensive line will improve. The D-line just loses a lot. It'll be a weakness on a very good defense. Team culture is a huge question mark. Scott Frost has never had it at Nebraska. I think he'll fix it. I think his new coordinators and some transfer portal additions that come from more winning programs, whether they're in the FCS division, Division 2, or whatnot, I think it'll get fixed, but it is a huge question mark, and there is no guarantee that it will be fixed. Again, these are just predictions. Nebraska's a total sleeper team, and they, unlike a team like Minnesota and even Michigan State, they have brought in consistent top 25 recruiting classes outside of this past seasons for the past several years. They do have talent, and their transfer portal additions, they had 10 or 11 incoming transfers. So they're really trying to win big this year, and I think they will. And I think they'll win their division and place first in the Big Ten West. Now we have Penn State. Penn State is interesting to me. They just extended James Franklin for, 10 years. what was it, like nearly 10 million a year. It was crazy. I thought it was asinine because I think that he is a huge weakness of theirs. Yes, he can recruit, so part of their strength is James Franklin off the field, but James Franklin on the field is a massive weakness. And this isn't even me being biased, because if you didn't know, I'm not a fan of James Franklin in general, but it's more because of his game day coaching. He's just not good at all at game day coaching. The Michigan game is a perfect example. It literally 2 fake plays in a row on 2 different drives. They both ended in basically fake plays. The fake punt, they actually converted, and then in the red zone, instead of going up by 6, they decide, we're going to do a fake field goal, and Michigan completely blows it up. Other games where he choked big leads, etc., I think he's a huge weakness, and I think Penn State fans will agree with me. Their offensive line is also really weak, and I think it'll continue to be that way next year as they lose some there. And running back, they do have Kevon Lee. Noah Kane left, but he was injured. And they do bring in Nicholas Singleton, but I think it'll take a year before their running backs get back to being the Penn State standard, which is great at Penn State. I mean, it's known for running back university for a reason. Strengths, though, they bring in, I forget his name, pardon me, but a really good wide receiver from Western Kentucky. I've looked up his stats, watched a little bit of him, and he's pretty good. They bring back Parker Washington as well, and Keandre Lambert-Smith, who are good wide receivers. Penn State always has a solid secondary, and they return their secondary coach, co-defensive coordinator Anthony Poindexter, so that's good. And they have a lot of impact freshmen, such as Nicholas Singleton, Drew Aller, Caden Saunders, guys who can immediately play. Danny Dennis Sutton is another one as well. All of those guys I mentioned are high 4 stars to 5 stars. Those guys, don't be surprised if some of them have immediate playing time or immediately start. Penn State can totally contend. I think they'll be 7-5, 5-4. They'll lose a non-conference game to Auburn, and they'll lose to Michigan, Ohio State. I think they will lose to Minnesota as well, and Purdue. They're only ahead of Michigan State because they'll beat them in the last game, I think, and that will be a tiebreaker. But Michigan State will be the better team. I don't think Penn State's going to be good once again, but they do have talent. They have impact freshmen, and if they play their cards right, they could totally finish 10-2 and contend for the Big Ten East and compete with Ohio State as they host Ohio State this year. That game might be a very interesting game to watch. And finally, we are on to Purdue. If you didn't notice, I'm going in alphabetical order for these teams. Purdue returns their quarterback, and they bring back some of their offensive line, bring in a transfer from FIU on their O-line. Aiden O'Connell is good. Not good. Good isn't good enough. He's elite. He is an elite quarterback, and I will fight anyone to support my opinion. He just doesn't have all the talent in the world around him. Yes, he has David Bell and Jackson Anthrop, who I think are gone, but who else does he have? Their running backs aren't good, their offensive line isn't world breaker, and their tight ends aren't amazing either. And, it's Purdue. It's hard to win at Purdue. And that's why Jeff Brom, this past season, really impressed me, especially that Tennessee win. That Tennessee win was huge. Tennessee, really powerful offense. Yes, it came down to a controversial play, but that one was huge. It showed what Purdue is in the future, even without George Karlaftis, even without David Bell. There's still a force to be reckoned with. Still a force. And I know that their front seven, losing Karlaftis, their other defensive end, and I think a linebacker or two, correct me if I'm wrong again. I always like it when people correct me and educate me on this stuff. But their front seven will be a weakness. Running back will be a weakness. Their lack of depth should be. I think their offensive line, it'll improve. It'll support Aiden O'Connell well. They return both of their starting tight ends, which should spark improvement in that area. Their wide receivers are always good under Jeff Brom. I mean, does anyone remember? You all have to if you aren't a casual fan. Rondale Moore from Purdue. David Bell and Jackson Anthrop were fantastic this past season, and they return Aiden O'Connell. What's not to like about Purdue? They could totally make some noise. Now, do I think they will? In a certain sense, yes, but in a certain sense, no. They do, outside of Nebraska, I think will have the best offense in the West. It'll be them and Nebraska vying for first. But unlike Nebraska, I just don't know if they'll have that solid defense. And again, it's just my opinion. And Nebraska is also bringing in a lot of transfers. Purdue necessarily isn't, but Purdue could totally win the West. And honestly, weirdly enough in the West, I don't think it's Iowa and Wisconsin's year. I think Purdue, Minnesota, and Nebraska, to a certain degree, actually have better chances, and it would make the West more competitive if they won. I think Purdue will go 8-4, 5-4, and I have them losing to, I think, one out of two to Wisconsin and Iowa. I have them losing to Nebraska. I have them losing to, I think, Minnesota, and I forget the other team, but 4 losses. You can find my opinion on them in my way too early Big Ten prediction video. It might not exactly line up, as some of my predictions have changed, but I think Purdue will finish 3rd in the Big Ten. They could contend for 2nd, maybe even 1st. Jeff Brom showed us last year that he still is a dangerous play caller and a good head coach. It's hard to get 9 wins at Purdue. Expect Purdue to make some noise. And that right here is really all I have to say, honestly. So all of these teams, I think, can compete for the Big Ten. All of them. I think that, Michigan State and Penn State in the East is traditionally stronger, and therefore if they were to actually win their division, they'd have a much better chance to win the Big Ten. Nebraska is kind of up there as well, mainly for the sole fact that it's the talent, the win now mentality, which, by the way, if they don't win now, there's an interesting thing that goes on. If Nebraska doesn't win right now, if they don't, the sad thing that happens really is that because of their poor recruiting class, it really affects their future. So there's truthfully a win now mentality with Nebraska, but they have the talent, they have the QB area. I think Nebraska, Michigan State, and Penn State could win the Big Ten if they reached the Big Ten championship game. Very small possibility. I would never expect such a thing to happen, but it's possible. Purdue and Minnesota, I just don't think have the same talent, even the same good enough coaching staffs outside of the head coach to win it either. Purdue and Minnesota could totally reach Indy. The chances of them winning it are next to 0. Nebraska, Michigan State's, and Penn State's, their percentages would probably be closer to 5% to 1% to winning it if they did, if they did get to Indy or whatever. It'd be much higher. Maybe not that low, but whatever. You get my point. So these are all sleeper teams that once again I think can compete. They're not like Michigan or Ohio State, who are the presumed favorites, although Ohio State's much more favored over Michigan for good reason. In the East, those teams are expected to be the best in the East. Same thing with Iowa and Wisconsin, who I, interestingly enough, think will have down years. I think Iowa will go 8-4. Wisconsin will go 7-5. I think Wisconsin will lose to Ohio State, Michigan State, Purdue, Iowa, and Nebraska. And I think Iowa will lose to Michigan, Ohio State, at Minnesota, and I think they will get upset. And this will be the part where, it becomes more than ever apparent that Brian Ferentz needs to go. I do think that they will get upset at Rutgers in their first conference game. Rutgers just being a solid team who can't be a sleeper yet, but I think that they are on the right track. The Big Ten is just overall so stacked. There's so many possible teams that can contend, but at the end of the day, these teams that I picked out were the proper teams, at least I think. Teams that can truly contend, they're not presumed favorites, but they do have some talent and merit to them and some weight to them as well, unlike a team like Northwestern or Illinois. Just two examples. That's all I have to say for this video, though. If you liked it, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Out of these 5 teams, who do you think is more likely to win the Big Ten? Let me know down below in the comment section. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys around. Bye.